Hello everybody, I'm Player Negative, and today we're talking about the controversy in Hollywood surrounding animation, and more likely how I want to talk about the scale of animation that a lot of people tend to ignore. Alright, let's get into it. So, a good majority, you probably remember this one adaptation of Pinocchio made by a melancholy stop-motion animator when he said when he got the award for Best Animation of the Year, or Best Film of the Year, he said the simple line of, "Animation is cinema." And granted, this was a lovely thing to hear at the time because of one particular reason. Because there's too many dumb people out there who still think animation is only for kids. With I just said, a lot of people are going to go, well, actually, what do you call all the adult cartoons we watch? What If, and a bunch of other newer animated projects that are for adults. And that's valid, but you need to stop talking because people have looked at animation too black and white, where you're either kiddie or you're raunchy and over mature. Now, you can clearly see with this special chart that I have set up that most modern animation series or movies or shows all stem to be either on the left or right of the scale of maturity. The lowest being Cocomelon, because let's face it, that stuff is garbage, and the top, which is Family Guy. And there's nothing inherently wrong with these, but I feel like what a lot of people miss is that most storytelling back in the day that was animated focused on being somewhere in the middle, right here. Good example of what I'm trying to say is the early 2015 animated movie by Warner Brothers, The Iron Giant. Now, at first, this movie's surface level was pretty simple. It's just about a boy and his robot fooling around in the era of the 1960s. However, when you peer past that simple plot point, there's actually a lot more to this movie than what most people let on. And it all stems from the giant himself. You see, throughout the giant's journey, he grows and develops from being something as simple as just a monster to being a person who wants to understand what it means to be alive or to do the right thing. And later on, as a simple little note that at first means nothing, when Hogarth pulls out a bunch of comic books, one character that Iron Giant inspires to be is Superman. Now, at first, this might seem like nothing because, this movie takes place in the 60s. Superman's a popular character around that time. And while that is true, to us, he's just a comic book character, but to the Giant, he's like a role model or something he aspires to be. Because Superman, to us, represents the ideals of what a good man with perfect intentions could be. For him, it's a mirror of what the Giant could be because he himself is an alien who was thrown onto Earth. And he embodies the noble ideals of what the Giant wishes to aspire to. However, not everything carries out well. Later on, it's discovered that there's a defense mechanism within the Giant that the Giant himself in the beginning has no control over, where if he's automatically met with a gun or fire, he will retort back with a weapon system in retaliation. And this shakes him to his core because it causes people to fear him, which hurts him a lot. And this sort of pain hurts because it shows that he's nothing more than a gun to people. And this one line by Hogarth manages to snap him out of it and allow him to gain control. And that is, you are who you choose to be. And that line hits hard because it shows the concept that if a gun can choose for its own will not to shoot, that a person can make the choice that can not only help themselves, but also help others. And that's the type of lesson this movie was trying to teach. It wasn't trying to dumb down the audience or try to be too preachy. It just had a good story to tell with a great message behind it. And that's what we need. You know what we also need? A villain who represents the conflicting fear. Allow me to introduce, with a heavy heart, Mansley. Who's Mansley, you ask? Well, only the movie's main villain. Unlike most villains, instead of falling in between two categories of either being irredeemable or sympathetic, Mansley is a new type of villain that you don't see very often. He's a character with reasonable fear who commits actions out of two different things that are dangerous when utilized: ignorance and fear. You see, throughout the entire story, Mansley starts off being ignorant to everything in the town, believing that this simple place of Rockwell is just a bunch of hillbillies who don't know what's going on. However, as he slowly starts to piece together the Giants' whereabouts, he becomes more and more paranoid and scared of what could be going on. And he sees Hogarth as his main lead, constantly stalking him or constantly trying to ask him weird questions. Now, from the viewer's perspective, this might just seem like stupidity, but he hasn't seen the stuff that we have, and not to mention he's in the military during the 60s. May I remind you that the Iron Giant takes around the place where the most common fear people had was having an atomic bomb dropped on them. This was like during the time where they taught that whole lesson of duck and cover. And this is when paranoia was at an all-time high. So the fact that he sees a giant and then connects his leads to some random kid with a bad name immediately causes his paranoia to go in overdrive. And when the military and everyone stops, he's going mad because he knows the dangers of what he could cause. And without thinking ignorance, he launches a missile on the entire town. He's a little bit annoying, but as a villain, from his perspective, he thinks what he's doing is justified because of his paranoia. And that is the type of villain I want to see more often. A villain with a justifiable reason to hate the hero, but gets ultimately disproven by the hero's actions. We need more of that. However, later on within the story, his logic is disproven and his fears are proven to be false when the giant decides to make the ultimate sacrifice. As the missile's going down and he tries to run, he's stopped, and the giant decides to make the ultimate sacrifice to save his only friend by flying directly into the nuke and taking the hit. And that right there is the type of character we need in stories. This is the type of movies we need now. Not something that dumbs you down, but something that respects your intelligence, tries to tell you a great story with an even greater message behind it. This is why I say with a heavy heart that we need more stories that focus on being in the middle of the scale of maturity or what kind of tone of storytelling you want to tell. But Iron Giant is not the only example I'm going to talk about. Far from it. Next up is... Our next movie on the list is Shrek. Yes, the original Shrek. Now, why it does go a little bit further up on the right to the scale, it's a perfect example of a movie that tries to have a balance between things. Now, instead of trying to do a heartfelt message like the Iron Giant does, it tries to be more satire, but also a little bit more funny with its message because it's supposed to subvert the tropes and unrealistic ideas of fairy tales. Now, Shrek tips a little towards the scale a little more, mainly due to the fact that it's got some jokes only adults gets, but overall, it's a pretty good movie because it focuses on bringing satire to classic fairy tales and trying to make fun of its competitors like Disney. But over the time, it tries to keep things safe, it tries to keep things casual. It's a pretty good series. I mean, you can never go wrong with it. I say it tries to, like I said, it tries. Our story begins with our ogre bursting through the door after reading an old fairy tale book that he immediately calls garbage. He's going about his normal business, farting in a swamp, causing a bunch of fish to die, and putting up signs to make people go away from him. So a bunch of people start grabbing their pitchforks and torches, like a normal angry mob does, and try to mess with him. But rather than acting like a big old monster, he instead just scares them by being reasonable and explaining how he would beat them up. But It's gruesome detail, but he explains it like he's just explaining a cookbook recipe. Like he's just being the most casual guy ever. But as soon as he shortens out someone's torch, he just goes, "This is the part where you run away." And everyone just immediately falls for it, showing that why he is scary, there's a lot more layers to the character, and that he genuinely just doesn't care at all. Now, after scaring these townspeople, a poster immediately catches Shrek's eye about fairy tale creatures for ransom, and learns that a idiot by the name of Lord Farquaad, who is basically one of the best DreamWorks villains, because similar to Mansley, he's just annoying and just meant to be a nuisance, not really a problem. Like, the whole point of this character is that he's supposed to make fun of the whole Prince Charming archetype. Like, instead of just being a one-note character who's a handsome royal person, he's not even a king, and he just hates anything fairy tale related and just wants to get rid of them. He spends a bunch of time torturing a gingerbread man just to know where the magic mirror is. And when he finally gets it, the mirror immediately insults him, telling him that he's technically not a king. However, but rather than opposing this or just shrugging it off, the show's incompetence, he explains that he's going to kill the mirror unless he fesses up, using one of his henchmen as an example of what they would do to him, showing his incompetence and how he hides behind people with more power to get what he wants. So, out of fear and nothing else, the magic mirror takes one look at Farquaad and tells him, "What I meant to say was, you're not a king yet, but you can become one. All you have to do is marry a princess." And at this point, he brings up 3 options for a princess he can marry. And since we're making fun of Disney, he brings up Cinderella and Snow White. However, he decides to pick the 3rd option, which is Princess Fiona, where he could have just easily just found a glass slipper or just kissed a random person lost in the woods. Instead, he chooses the most dangerous area, where a princess is guarded in a castle by a giant fire-breathing dragon. And rather than aiding her and going to her rescue, he hosts a tournament to have someone else do it for him. And to surprise of absolutely no one, Shrek wins the tournament due to his overhulking size. Rather than doing this to save the princess, though, he negotiates with Farquaad to get his swamp back and to get all the fairy tale creatures who would decide to take residence in the area. Which, to be fair, I wouldn't blame him. If a bunch of people were invading my private property, I wouldn't want them there. And so, Shrek, with donkey in hand, wander across separate fields all the way to the dragon's lair, wearing a suit of busted up armor he stole from an old knight who probably perished from the fire. However, rather than your traditional fairy tale situation where the knight slays the dragon and saves the princess, Shrek just grabs the princess and runs. Why Donkey is simply distracting the dragon and locking them up in chains to leave later on with the situation. Now, when Fiona sees that it was some random ogre who saved her and that the person who actually cares about her didn't even bother to try to help, she's pretty much frustrated and decides to just head over there with Shrek to break a curse that both of them know nothing about. And it was the very curse that Lord Farquaad ignored when choosing a princess. Now, what is this curse, you may ask? Well, basically, every night she turns into what is considered the most ugliest thing in the world, an ogre. And basically, by the will of true love, beauty would take its true form. Just some basic fairy tale bullcrap, basically. But as Shrek, Donkey, and Fiona are racing down to get back to Farquaad's castle, Shrek becomes pretty friendly with Fiona, and Fiona actually has genuine feelings for them as a close friend and a companion. However, it evolves later down the line. And rather than just being a damsel in distress, Fiona's actually capable of knowing how to fight and is a pretty reasonable person. Something you wouldn't see in a simple Disney movie. The whole point of this movie is that Now, the whole point about this movie, and I think this is important, is that it tries to be anti-Disney. It tries to subvert your expectations of fairy tales. Because fairy tales are pretty basic. They're unrealistic, and they give people ideals or thoughts that aren't exactly true. This movie does the job of subverting those ideas and asking the question, hey, what if fairy tales exist in a world that treated things more realistic? Where characters aren't just two-dimensional, but actually people. And I enjoy that concept a lot. And while it did have a lot of weird adult themes, it did a good job with what it was dealt with. And it was the first of very few 3D films that did well. And I hope you understand that as well. Anyways, continuing with the story, Farquaad, being the jerk that he is, finds the group and takes her back, and Fiona and Shrek are mad at each other because Shrek heard something out of context and thought it was insulting him, calling him a beast. Donkey decides to take some of the land of the swamp because the deed involved who did the work, and because he believed that he did most of the work dealing with the dragon. He owns half the swamp and berates Shrek for not telling her how she feels. And he says the reason why he's standing by him is because friends forgive each other. And I really appreciate that. Most Disney sidekicks are just friends right off the bat, but here you actually get to see the development between them grow and change, and I appreciate that. Anyways, Shrek storms the castle and explains the actual reason why Farquaad is choosing to marry her is so he can become king and wipe out multiple fairy tale people. And immediately Farquaad denies it, declares himself king, and as the curse is revealed, he's immediately taken back by the thought of Shrek even having any form of affection for people and calling him a monster. However, like most fairy tale villains, he finally gets his comeuppance by both Shrek and Fiona and manages to be defeated. And Fiona kissing Shrek, finally breaking the curse. Instead of turning back into a normal human, they turn into an ogre as the permanent. Eventually, they hit it off at a wedding, and it ends like the basic fairy tale stigma of happily forever after. And honestly, this movie, while it did have satire, was actually well written and focused more on having an actual story with more merit than a fairy tale, which, in my opinion, was a really interesting move, because this entire movie is about making fun of fairy tales like Disney and showing a more well-in-depth story, which I appreciate. Which is why this movie's staying a little bit further up on the scale while still maintaining the middle spot that most animation should and can strive for. I moved it up there slightly because of the adult jokes. However, this movie is far from my last example. The next movie, and I think one that completely encapsulates how to write a good story with an interesting message that is respectful of the viewer's intelligence, is a 2005's Robots. Now, partially, I picked this movie because of nostalgia, but looking back on it, I can clearly see why this movie is an ideal pick based off its main themes and its main character, which I will introduce right now. May I interest you, Rodney Copperbottom, local young man and well-known inventor. Just kidding, he's some random guy who only inspires to be an inventor like his idol Bigwell. The whole thing about this character is that, very similar to other inventors like Flint Lockwood, he's smart, but that's not his whole personality. Instead of spitting out a bunch of nonsense that makes no sense, the robots are explained and have simple, more clockwork mechanical parts, which I actually appreciate the design and work that went into them. Not to mention the colors and fade design for the character just looks really nice. His whole goal is that he inspires to create and invent things to make people's lives better, just like his idol Bigwell, and also to support his father in his financial struggles. And the movie takes its time to explain this to you. Now, if this were in a modern-day Disney movie, they'd probably slap a bunch of text on a screen describing to this, but instead, they actually show you, and you learn these themes through subtle hints and actual character build-up. So, around this time, he's now old enough to be working in the restaurant with himself, and he decides to help his dad by creating the worker bot, to help his father in his old age and to help him with his simple job of repairing the dishes in a restaurant that wouldn't give two craps about. However, due to the fact that the robot has one major design flaw, it screws up under pressure. Mr. Gunk, Rodney's father's boss, screws it up, and he learns that his people in this town will not value his inventions, so he has to head out to Robot City to meet people who will and try to join Bigwell Industries. His family at first is against it, but later on, due to the fact that Rodney's father was once a musician who made the mistake of giving up on his dreams, he doesn't want Rodney to suffer the same fate, so supports him and gives him permission to head into Robot City. And upon his arrival to Robot City at the train station, he runs into one of the best characters ever played by the now deceased Robin Williams. Rest in peace, good friend. And that is Fender, not to be confused with Bender from Futurama. Fender is a outmoded robot trying to get by with any parts he can find to sustain himself considering the current state of the economy. But from Rodney's perspective, he's just some random weirdo he met on the train station, which will be important later on. So, after an absurd marble race, Rodney manages to get to Bigwell Industries, but is immediately shut out because they have stated that they don't need inventors anymore. This sounds like absolute bullcrap because you never shut out the front gate means shutting out fresh new ideas. And basically he tries to sneak his way into the building to present his ideas to Bigwell. However, instead, Ratchet basically fired Bigwell, or got him out somehow, and has taken over the company and is running it into the ground. Kind of like how Nintendo is with Doug Bowser, but only worse, and it actually destroys the middle class. Rodney gets immediately kicked out and covered in magnetized shards of metal that causes everything to attract to him and him to end up in the lower class section of the city, injured and battered, with his foot being stolen by, you guessed it, Fender, who immediately forgets that he was ever talking to this guy and runs away with it. After a quick montage, Fender's head falls off, and this is when we meet the rest of the extended cast of characters. Clanker, Gasket, Piper, and Rudd. Now, at first, these guys are all very offensive to Rodney, seeing him as a mugger, but later they understand the situation that Fender was just trying to steal some random guy's foot. And since Rodney is flat broke, they decide to let them stay in the random inn with Aunt Fanny. Now, I want you to take a wild guess on why they call her that. You know what? I'll just let this clip speak for itself.
Look, she's not my aunt. She just takes in bots who are broke.
Bless her little heart.
Well, then why is she called Aunt Fanny?
We couldn't call her Aunt Booty.
Whoa!
Yeah, that scene should probably speak enough for itself, if you know what I mean. So, basically, the rest of the plot follows that Rodney learns that Bigwell has gone missing, and that basically absolutely no one cares. Because of this situation, and because Ratchet is basically depriving people of the parts they desperately need so they get sent down to the chop shop, it's now up to him to find Bigwell and make things right within Robot City. He starts by fixing hundreds of people who have been deprived of the parts they need to sustain themselves. And then it's on the search for Bigwell by getting into the Bigwell Ball. Now, after getting some cheap disguises, they manage to sneak into the place. However, Rodney is about to be arrested until he's saved and later finds Bigwell, who is completely given up on his dreams and looks at Rodney and just, well, tells him to shut up and just go away. And this sends Rodney to his lowest. He sits at the train station wanting to head out until he hears a warm, heartening speech from his father on how he should never give up, or the fact that he'll always be thinking about what he could have done will haunt him. What immediately follows is Aunt Fanny and the rest of the group finding out that Fender figured out who the real culprit is, and that Ratchet's just a figurehead, and that the actual person causing all this trouble is someone by the name of Madame Gasket. And them and Ratchet both plan to try to kill every outmode in the middle class of the city to make room for upgrades and more higher class robots. Rodney and the rest of the group finally decide to get off their butts and stop this, as well as Big Well finally getting off his metal chassis and actually deciding to do something rather than messing with dominoes and actually deal with the problem, inspired by Rodney's willingness to fight back and stand his ground. And I really just want to take a moment to actually enjoy the fact that the main protagonist inspired the person he looked up to get back on his feet after so many years of losing faith in himself. Honestly, I wish this trope was more utilized. The only other movie I can think of that used this idea was Angry Birds, and the sequel was just garbage of that. Anyways, Big Well gets immediately captured by Madame Gaskin. So naturally, Rodney upgrades the rest of the gang to fight back against Madame Gasket with everything they got, from random scrap metal to extra tires to literally anything you can find sitting around that junk heap. However, Madame Gasket fights back with giant amounts of sweepers, which, if you don't know what a sweeper is, it's basically a giant junkyard truck that kills robots. As all hope seems lost, hundreds of robots that were fixed by Rodney all storm to join the fight and eventually defeat them at the end, freeing Big Weld and fixing Robot City. And after the fight, the movie goes to its beautiful conclusion of Big Well showing up at Rodney's hometown to proclaim that he's back in the industry, as well as appointing Rodney as his apprentice and eventual successor. In conclusion, animation is not just made for kids or adults. There is a in-between that modern filmmakers have missed out on. But don't fret. Things can change with your help. Yes, you. Pick up the pen, create, draw something, write something, make a podcast if you have to. You have the ability to change the entertainment landscape with your hands. In the words of the real-life fake wizard, create, innovate, and for the love of all that's good, cancel Disney Plus. I'm Player Negative, and I'll be seeing you very soon. Ba-da-da-da-da-da.